Darkness fell on Italy long before the sun ever set. It began with a whisper, soft, trembling, slipping between olive trees and stone houses like a chill that didn't belong to any season. Villagers claimed it was the wind, but the wind does not murmur children's names. It does not knock gently on windows in the dead of night, and it certainly does not laugh. But on one unforgettable night, the laughter echoed from the hills, a sound too delicate for demons, too cruel for angels, and too human for comfort. That was the night people began to fear the witch boys of Italy. And now you're about to hear their story, one soaked in smoke, superstition, fire, fear, and the unexplainable power carried in the hearts of boys who never asked to be born different. Welcome to another chapter of our Dark History series, where forgotten horrors, hidden truths, and tales buried by time rise from the ashes. If you're new here, I'm thrilled to have you. If you've been following our journey, welcome back to the shadows. Before we begin this chilling tale of witchcraft, persecution, and mystery, I kindly ask you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single dark twist or forgotten legend. The heat of late summer still clung to the stones of San Damiano sul Monte when the sky decided to die. All day the village had simmered beneath a white, blinding sun. Laundry hung from lines like surrendered flags, cicadas screamed from the pines, and the old men in flat caps sat motionless in the piazza, too tired even to argue about politics. It was the kind of day when time felt heavy, when shadows hid close against the walls, and no one expected anything but the slow drift toward evening. And then, without warning, the light began to fade. Matteo noticed it first, not with his eyes, but with his skin. He was halfway up the rocky path that led to the family vineyard, a basket of tools bumping against his leg, when a prickle swept over his arms. The sweat on his neck cooled in an instant. The air, which had been thick as soup, thinned like something was sucking it away. He stopped and looked up. The sun still hung where it should, a bright coin nailed to the blue. But around it, the sky had darkened to a bruised, impossible indigo, as if night were pushing its way in from the edges. Birds erupted from the olive trees in frantic flocks. The cicadas fell silent. Somewhere below, a dog began to howl, a long, broken sound that didn't seem satisfied to end. The village bells started ringing, not in the slow, familiar rhythm that called people to mass, but in a sharp, panicked clamor. The sound rolled up the hill toward Matteo, echoing off the stone terraces and the crumbling walls. He could hear voices now, too, disembodied shouts carried on the wind, filling the spaces where the cicadas had been. The basket slipped from his hand and tipped, spilling pruning shears and twine into the dust. He scarcely heard it. The sun was shrinking. A black disk, perfectly round and perfectly wrong, was sliding over its face from the right, swallowing the light a sliver at a time. It moved slowly, almost gently, but the effect was anything but gentle. The world dimmed. Colors bled away. The whitewashed houses below turned gray. The red tile roofs dulled to rust. The distant river became a strip of lead. The old women in San Damiano had a word for such things. They called them segni, signs, warnings, promises. Matteo only knew that something was watching. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't God, not the way Father Ricci described him on Sundays with warm voice and open hands. Whatever watched now felt colder, more curious than loving. As if the village were a beetle pinned to a board and the darkening sky leaned in to see if it still twitched. His heart kicked against his ribs. For a moment he thought of running back down the hill to the safety of his mother's kitchen, to the smell of onion and garlic and tomato, to the familiar clutter of copper pots and the comfort of a scolding. But his legs wouldn't move. They were rooted to the earth,
as fixed as the twisted trunks of the grapevines that surrounded him. The light dimmed further. Shadows stretched long and thin, like black fingers groping toward him. Matteo wasn't afraid of the dark. He had slept alone under the low, slanted roof of the attic since he was 8. He had walked home from catechism late in winter evenings when the stars were sharp and cold over the valley. Darkness was a blanket, something that wrapped the village in quiet. This was not that darkness. This was a hole being torn in the sky. It reached his ears before it reached his eyes, a low humming sound, like hundreds of bees trapped inside a jar. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the stones under his feet, from the trees, from somewhere deep inside his skull. His teeth vibrated with it. A voice whispered his name. It was so soft he almost didn't hear it, a slip of sound between the hum and the tolling bells. Matteo! He spun around, heart lurching. The path behind him was empty. The terraces below were empty. Even the vineyard felt deserted, the leaves unmoving, the grapes hanging like lumps of shadow. No one stood there. No one could have spoken.
Still, he had heard it, clear, undeniable. His name, curved in the vowels of his region, said the way only his mother and the villagers ever said it. The humming grew louder. The sun was now a sliver, a crescent of wounded light. The sky had deepened to a color he had never seen before, somewhere between blue and black, like the bruises that bloomed on his father's hands after a long day in the fields. Matteo! The second whisper slid along his spine like cold water. It wasn't behind him this time. It wasn't ahead of him either. It was inside his head, but not like his own thoughts. It felt old, heavy. It felt like something reaching up from under the ground. He clapped his hands over his ears. The bells kept ringing wild and fast. The humming thickened, turning into a pressure that tightened against his skull. The shadows lengthened again, and suddenly he wasn't standing on a hill above a familiar village. He was standing on the edge of something else entirely, something ancient and patient, waiting just beneath the skin of the world. For a moment, the vineyard wavered. The rows of vines and the low stone wall seemed to shiver, becoming translucent. Through them, as if through a layer of fog, he glimpsed other shapes. A line of people trudging up a hill under a much paler sky, torches instead of electric lights, hoods, ropes, the suggestion of a wooden stake. He blinked hard, and they were gone. San Damiano snapped back into solid reality. The vines, the dirt path, the sagging scarecrow in the next field, the cluster of houses below clinging to the hillside like barnacles. He could even smell the usual scents again: dry earth, crushed thyme, the faint, sweet tang of fermenting grapes from the small cantina near the road. But he could not shake the feeling that he had slipped, just for a second, sideways in time. The bells changed rhythm. Someone down in the village had taken control of the ropes, calling the people to gather. Emergency, danger, a sound older than electricity, older than engines, older than most of the houses themselves. Matteo finally found his legs. He ran. The path twisted between terraces, dropping steeply. Stones rolled under his soles. He skidded and nearly fell, righted himself, kept going. The air was much cooler now. The light had thinned to something eerie and metallic. His own shadow looked wrong, stretched and bent in ways it shouldn't, as if it belonged to someone else sprinting alongside him. As he reached the first cluster of houses, the air filled with voices. People shouted from windows, stood in doorways with rosaries clutched white-knuckled in their hands. A baby wailed somewhere, its cry slicing through the bells and the humming and the frantic murmur of Hail Marys. Over all of it loomed the unnatural dark. He burst into the piazza, breathing hard. Nearly everyone in San Damiano was there. Old Nana the Chia, with her black shawl pulled tight over her head,
lips moving in constant prayer. The butcher with blood still on his apron. Children clinging to their mother's skirts. Teenagers pretending not to be afraid, but staring up with wide eyes. At the center of the square, Father Ricci had planted himself in front of the small stone church. He held a wooden crucifix high in one hand, his other hand cutting the air in emphatic blessing. His voice rose above the others, strong and steady, reciting the words of protection, of faith, of trust in God's will. But even he kept glancing up at the sky. The sun was almost gone. Only a thin ring of light remained, like a halo placed around a wound. The rest was black, not the soft, deep dark of a moonless night, but a flat, hungry black that made Matteo's eyes ache. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. A chill slid through the piazza. People shivered, pulled their children closer. The animals sensed it too. The mules stamped and tossed their heads. The chickens in the nearby yards fell into a strange, unsettled quiet. And then, as if a switch had been thrown somewhere beyond the mountains, the last sliver of sun was devoured. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No bells, no prayers, no voices, only the ring of fire in the sky, and a silence so total it roared. In that silence, Matteo heard them. Not one voice now, but many, layers and layers of whispers, as if every stone in the village had learned to speak and chosen this moment to do it. The sound flowed around him, through him, over the edges of his bones. At first he couldn't pick out any words. They were just a susurrus, a tide of breath and syllable. Then one rose above the rest, clear and close to his ear. "We're still here."
He jerked his head toward the sound. No one stood beside him. The villagers were all focused on the sky, eyes wide, mouths open. Some were on their knees, others stared with the stiff stillness of prey that knows the predator has finally seen it. Another whisper, from the other side. "They forgot us." He turned again, empty air. The fountain, its basin dry because the pump had broken last month. The bench where the old men usually sat. Nothing. The voices didn't come from people. They came from below, from the stones beneath his feet, from the earth under the stones, from the deep packed layers of soil and bone and memory that had been building there for centuries. Every step he took seemed to press on a bruise in the ground and make it speak. Images tumbled through his mind, unbidden. A boy his age, hands tied behind his back with rough rope, standing in this same piazza centuries earlier, eyes wide with fear and fury, a crowd around him, faces hard and unforgiving, torches raised, a man in dark robes reading from a parchment. "Strega, stregone, maleficio." The words didn't come in his own voice. They arrived whole, heavy with someone else's accent, someone else's terror. The sun returned slowly, as if ashamed of having fled. First came a pale, sickly gray across the rooftops. Then the halo around the black disk thinned, cracked, and finally broke apart until the familiar harsh gold of late afternoon spilled once more over San Damiano sul Monte. The villagers exhaled in one trembling wave, like a single creature released from a trap. Some cried, some laughed nervously. A few dropped to their knees and thanked God with shaking hands raised toward the sky. But even as life resumed, cicadas stuttering back to song, dogs barking in confused circles, people stumbling home with embarrassed fear, Matteo stood perfectly still. The whispers had not faded. They remained under the stones, inside the earth, coiled like smoke in the corners of his mind. He tried to blink them away. He tried to breathe deeply, as his mother taught him when he panicked during storms. None of it helped. If anything, the whispers grew clearer now that the world had sound again, as though some invisible barrier had cracked during the eclipse, allowing old voices to seep through. By the time Matteo reached home, his shirt clung to him with cold sweat. His mother immediately scolded him for running, for losing the tools, for vanishing during a cosmic omen. But Matteo barely heard her.
Every room of the house carried faint echoes that didn't belong. The attic hummed with restless shifts of air. Even the narrow corridor seemed to inhale each time he passed through it. The house was alive in ways it shouldn't be. That night he could not sleep.
He lay in his small bed beneath the slanted ceiling of the attic, staring at the wooden beams. Moonlight leaked through the tiny circular window, washing the room in a soft silver that should have been calming, but nothing brought calm. The whispers rose and fell like breaths. Sometimes they were distant, like voices across a field. Sometimes they were close, so close he felt the warmth of them at his ear. He covered his head with his pillow. It did nothing. He squeezed his eyes shut and curled his hands into fists. Still nothing. Hours passed. The house settled into the deep silence of night, and the village beyond did the same. Only the rustle of wind along the terracotta rooftops hinted at the normal world, but Matteo no longer felt entirely part of it. The eclipse had left a mark, an invisible line drawn between him and everyone else. When the whisper came again, it was clearer than ever. "Help me!" The voice was small, desperate. Not the old layered voices from earlier, but a single one, trembling on the edge of being forgotten. Matteo's breath caught. He sat up slowly, the blanket sliding off his legs. The attic seemed colder, the moonlight dimmer. "Help me!" He looked around. The room was empty, the stillness so complete that dust motes drifted lazily in the moonbeam without disturbance. He knew better than to call out, better than to ask who it was. Speaking to things unseen was dangerous. Everyone in the village knew that. But the whisper came again, more urgent this time, almost pleading. "I can't find the door to go home." Matteo swung his legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor was icy under his feet. He hesitated, listening. Nothing moved. The whispers had vanished, replaced by the soft, lonely cry of that single voice. He knew where it was coming from. Not outside, not beneath the bed, not inside the walls. It came from the window. Slowly he crossed the attic. The moon glowed white beyond the circular glass, illuminating the rooftops of San Damiano, the narrow streets, the distant hills that curved like sleeping giants. The night was beautiful in a way the eclipse had not been. It looked harmless, ordinary, normal. But the whisper was anything but. "Please!" Matteo leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. Something flickered at the edge of the rooftop across the street. At first he thought it was an owl. Then the shape grew sharper, resolving into the outline of a child, no more than 6 or 7, sitting with knees pulled to its chest. His heart froze. The child's head lifted slightly, but its face remained in shadow. The whisper came again, faint as mist. "I can't find the door to go home."
Matteo stumbled back, nearly tripping over his discarded blanket. His throat tightened as panic fluttered through him. He blinked hard, hoping the shape would vanish. Ghosts were stories told to frighten children away from wandering at night, nothing more. But when he looked again, the child was still there, still waiting, still watching. He backed away until his legs hit the bed, then climbed in and pulled the blanket over his head like a shield. He stayed like that until dawn, trembling every time the wind scraped against the roof tiles. When morning came, he expected the whispers to be gone. They weren't. He walked through the kitchen, and the voices floated between the jars of preserves. He crossed the courtyard, and they rose from the old stone well. At school, they clustered around him like smoke, murmuring fragments of stories he didn't understand. He flinched at every sudden sound, jumped each time someone touched him, avoided speaking whenever possible. By midday, even the other children noticed. Matteo had always been quiet, but now he was pale and skittish. The teacher asked if he felt sick. He nodded, even though he wasn't sure what kind of sickness this was. She sent him home early. The walk back felt endless. Each step carried echoes he didn't want to hear. Each wall whispered names he didn't know. By late afternoon, Matteo sat at the edge of the vineyard where the eclipse had first spoken to him.
He picked at the dirt, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched by something older than the hills. A new whisper drifted to him. You saw it too. This time the voice was not disembodied. It came from behind him. Matteo turned slowly. A boy older than him, maybe 13, stood between the vines. His dark hair hung in loose curls, and his clothes looked worn as if he'd been wandering for hours. But his eyes, there was something in them Matteo recognized immediately, a raw alertness, a haunted sheen. You heard them, the older boy said quietly. Didn't you? Matteo swallowed hard. He couldn't lie, not to someone who looked at him like that. The older boy stepped closer, scanning the vineyard as though expecting something to leap out at them. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the heavy knowledge of someone who had lived with whispers longer than just one night. Matteo stumbled back, nearly tripping over his discarded blanket. His throat tightened as panic fluttered through him. He blinked hard, hoping the shape would vanish. Ghosts were stories told to frighten children away from wandering at night, nothing more. But when he looked again, the child was still there, still waiting, still watching. He backed away until his legs hit the bed, then climbed in and pulled the blanket over his head like a shield. He stayed like that until dawn, trembling every time the wind scraped against the roof tiles. When morning came, he expected the whispers to be gone. They weren't. He walked through the kitchen, and the voices floated between the jars of preserves. He crossed the courtyard, and they rose from the old stone well. At school, they clustered around him like smoke, murmuring fragments of stories he didn't understand. He flinched at every sudden sound, jumped each time someone touched him, avoided speaking whenever possible. By midday, even the other children noticed. Matteo had always been quiet, but now he was pale and skittish. The teacher asked if he felt sick. He nodded, even though he wasn't sure what kind of sickness this was. She sent him home early. The walk back felt endless. Each step carried echoes he didn't want to hear. Each wall whispered names he didn't know. By late afternoon, Matteo sat at the edge of the vineyard where the eclipse had first spoken to him. He picked at the dirt, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched by something older than the hills. A new whisper drifted to him. You saw it too. This time the voice was not disembodied. It came from behind him. Matteo turned slowly. A boy older than him, maybe 13, stood between the vines. His dark hair hung in loose curls, and his clothes looked worn as if he'd been wandering for hours. But his eyes, there was something in them Matteo recognized immediately, a raw alertness, a haunted sheen. You heard them, the older boy said quietly. Didn't you? Matteo swallowed hard. He couldn't lie, not to someone who looked at him like that. The older boy stepped closer, scanning the vineyard as though expecting something to leap out at them. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the heavy knowledge of someone who had lived with whispers longer than just one night. They're not going to stop, he said. Not now that they've woken. Matteo's breath came shallow. The older boy crouched beside him. My name is Luca, he said, and you're not the only one who can hear the dead. Matteo stared, wide-eyed. For the first time since the eclipse, he felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not fear, but a strange stirring of recognition. He wasn't alone. And that, somehow, was even more terrifying. The vineyard felt smaller with Luca standing in it, as though the rows of vines were leaning inward to listen. Matteo didn't know whether to feel comforted or hunted. The whispers had been tormenting him for less than a day, but Luca moved like someone who had been living alongside them for years. His shoulders were tense, his steps careful, his eyes scanning the world with the suspicion of a stray animal that had learned everything the hard way. Luca didn't speak again for a long moment. He just looked at the cracked earth beneath their feet, tilting his head slightly as if hearing something Matteo couldn't yet detect. When he finally lifted his gaze, the expression he wore was not pity, not fear, but grim certainty. Others will come, he said, not with his mouth.
His words fell between the vines like leaves carried on a gust of wind. Matteo's eyes widened. He hadn't imagined it. Luca hadn't spoken aloud. The whisper had traveled the same way all the strange voices had, but it was unmistakably human, unmistakably Luca. Matteo's breath hitched. He shook his head more out of instinct than denial. He didn't want to understand what had just happened, but the truth settled into him with cold finality. He could hear the dead. Luca could hear the living, without speaking. Whatever force had awakened during the eclipse was gathering them like scattered pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. Matteo rose slowly from the ground. The vines seemed to sway around them, though no wind stirred. Beyond the vineyard, the village carried on with its day. Women hanging laundry, men tending fields, children chasing each other along the narrow lanes. Life continued, blissfully unaware that something ancient had stretched its limbs beneath their feet.
Luca started walking toward the lower terrace without waiting for an invitation. Matteo hesitated for a heartbeat before following. They walked between the grapevines, their shadows stretching long across the uneven earth. Matteo kept his hands tucked close to his sides, as though afraid to brush against something unseen. Luca, however, walked with purpose, glancing toward the edges of the vineyard as though someone or something might emerge at any moment. Matteo finally found his voice. "How long have you been like this?" Luca didn't answer immediately. When he did, his tone was flat, practiced, like someone reciting the facts of a scar. "Since I was 9. Matteo stumbled on a loose stone. 2 years? He had barely survived 1 day of this. How had Luca lived with voices, living, dead, or something in between, for so long? The thought sent a shiver crawling up his spine. Luca continued. "I used to think something had gone wrong in my head. Then things started happening around me. People hearing me when I hadn't spoken. Animals moving toward my thoughts. Doors unlocking when I needed them to. Voices drifting from the ground at night. It never stopped, not even when I ran away." Matteo froze. "Ran away?" Luca nodded. "From the orphanage, from everywhere. People notice when you're different, especially here." Matteo didn't need further explanation. San Damiano might have modern plaster on its walls and satellite dishes on its rooftops, but its heart was old. The villagers still believed in curses, evil eyes, blessings, omens. Boys who heard the dead or spoke without opening their mouths did not survive long in places like this, not without someone trying to cleanse them or fix them, or worse. Matteo swallowed hard. "Why are you here now?" Luca finally stopped walking. He turned toward the chest-high stone wall that marked the edge of the vineyard, leaning against it with an exhausted slump. His voice lowered, sinking into the rhythm of the whispering earth beneath them. The eclipse woke them. Luca didn't ask who. He already sensed the answer. The dead, the forgotten, the blamed, the accused. The boys like them. Children who had been silenced centuries ago under charges of witchcraft, superstition, and fear were awake again, and their voices were crawling up through soil and root and shadow. But Luca continued. The eclipse didn't just wake them, it woke us. Matteo felt the truth of that deep in his bones. They fell quiet for a moment. The vineyard around them tilted into eerie stillness. Birds kept their distance. The usual hum of insects seemed to slow, as if nature itself listened to their thoughts. Matteo's heartbeat echoed in his ears. "Others will come," Luca had said. Others like what? Like them? Like the children he had glimpsed last night, trapped between worlds, unable to find their doors home? Or others like Luca, boys marked by some unseen power? He turned toward the village. The rooftops shone with late sunlight, calm and innocent. But beneath the quiet surface, the whispers stirred again, rising like the rustle of dry leaves. Matteo heard his own name, faint but distinct. Not spoken by Luca, not spoken by the dead child on the rooftop. A new voice, soft, young, somewhere close,
Matteo stiffened. Luca straightened instantly, eyes narrowing, jaw tensing. He heard it too. The voice drifted again, barely above air. Matteo recognized the direction. It came from the row of olive trees at the base of the vineyard, beyond the crumbling stone wall. The trees cast long shadows across the slope, the leaves clinging to their muted silver-green hues as the day faded. Matteo stepped toward the wall. Luca grabbed his wrist, not roughly, but with sudden urgency. His grip was warm, grounding, reminding Matteo that this was no ordinary call. "He will be afraid," Luca whispered. "They always are at first." Matteo knew who Luca meant before he stepped over the wall. A boy stood among the olive trees. He was younger than Matteo, maybe 8 or 9. His hair was dusty blonde, sticking out in uneven tufts as if he had been running. His clothes were wrinkled and smeared with dirt. His eyes, wide, frantic, shimmering with something Matteo recognized far too well, shifted between the shadows as though expecting them to swallow him whole. Matteo froze. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't calling out for a parent. He wasn't lost in any ordinary sense. His whisper reached Matteo's mind like a trembling leaf drifting down. "Is it happening to you too?" Matteo felt the world tilt slightly. The boy wasn't speaking aloud. The words came exactly the way Luca's had, clean, intrusive, inevitable. Luca stepped beside Matteo, nodding slowly to the boy under the olive tree. His expression softened with a sadness far too old for his 13 years. "Come here," he whispered. The boy took 2 small steps forward. His hands were clenched into trembling fists, his breath coming in fast, sharp bursts. Matteo felt something tighten in his chest at the sight. He saw himself reflected there, a child cornered by something invisible, by a fear no adult would understand. The boy's thoughts flickered again, fragmented and frightened. "They keep touching me." Matteo flinched. Luca's eyes widened just slightly. The dead whispered. The living whispered. This boy felt the dead. Matteo heard the dead. Luca projected thoughts. Each boy carried a different wound from the same ancient scar. Luca moved forward and knelt in front of the frightened child, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. The boy inhaled sharply at the contact but didn't pull away. "What's your name?" Luca's thoughts drifted gently. The boy blinked, hesitating. Then a name came with the shiver of leaves overhead. "Sandro." Matteo repeated it silently. "Sandro." Luca stood and guided Sandro back up the slope toward the vineyard. Matteo followed closely, glancing nervously at the shadows between the olive trees. The air around them thickened with whispers again, but there was something sharper now, like a warning crawling beneath the ground. They weren't the only ones listening. As they reached the vineyard terrace, Matteo felt the weight of the soil shift, as though unseen eyes watched from below. Sandro clung to Luca's sleeve. The older boy's face tightened, but his posture remained steady. 3 boys gathered on an Italian hillside. 3 boys touched by something older than the village, older than the church, older than the stones of the mountain itself. The earth seemed to pulse once under their feet, a tremor so faint Matteo thought he imagined it, but Luca's eyes flicked downward. Sandro grabbed Matteo's hand. Something moved. A whisper rose from the ground, deeper, lower, charged with a memory of fire and ropes and screams swallowed by centuries. "They are coming." Matteo's blood ran cold. Luca offered a single thought, steeled with resolve. "Then we find the others before they do." The man arrived 3 days after the eclipse, on a bus that coughed black smoke as it labored up the narrow road to San Damiano sul Monte. The villagers watched its approach the way they might watch a storm wandering too close to the valley, unsure whether it would pass them by or break open on their heads. Buses rarely came this far unless it was summer and tourists were searching for rustic views and cheap wine. It was not summer now. The vineyards were heavy with fruit, yes, but the air carried the brittle tension of early autumn, and the eclipse had turned even the most practical villagers into people who checked the sky twice as often. The bus shuddered to a stop at the small square of cracked asphalt near the edge of the village. Its doors hissed open. For a moment, no one stepped out. The driver leaned forward and peered down the aisle, then jerked his chin. A figure rose from one of the front seats and descended slowly into view. He did not look like the villagers. His coat was too long, too black, too smooth for a place where everything was sun-faded and patched. It swallowed his narrow frame, falling almost to his ankles. Underneath, Matteo glimpsed a dark suit, a strip of white at the throat. The man's hair was iron gray, combed back neatly from a high forehead, and his skin had the pale, sheltered quality of someone who spent little time under open sky. But it was his eyes that pinned the villagers in place, a cold, measuring gray that seemed to weigh each person it passed over, sorting them into invisible categories.
He stepped down from the bus with care, placing one polished shoe and then the other on the ground, as though crossing a threshold that mattered. He did not look around in wonder or confusion, did not fumble with luggage or maps. He simply stood for a moment, inhaled the mountain air, and turned toward the heart of San Damiano as if he already knew exactly where he was going. By the time he reached the piazza, word had outrun him. Matteo stood in the shadow of the church, hands jammed into the pockets of his faded jeans, watching the stranger's progress along the narrow lane. Luca was a step behind him, leaning against the stone wall with casual stillness that fooled no one who knew him. Sandro hovered close at Matteo's other side, chewing the inside of his cheek, eyes tracking every movement with frightened precision. The stranger walked like a blade, cutting the crowd as he passed. People parted not because he asked them to, but because something in their bones recognized an old pattern, the arrival of a man who would ask questions no one wanted to hear. He stopped in front of Father Ricci. The parish priest's cassock was worn at the edges, his hair thinning, his cheeks ruddy from years in the sun. He had a kind face, but there was a line between his brows that had deepened significantly since the eclipse. Now that line sharpened as he studied the newcomer's collar, his coat, the small silver cross pinned discreetly at his lapel. "Welcome to San Damiano," Father Ricci said, his voice careful. The stranger inclined his head with precise politeness. His words, when they came, were smooth and measured, carrying the faintest trace of a northern accent. "Thank you, Padre. I am Father Lorenzo Bianchi. I've been sent to assist you." "Assist me?" The repetition tasted strange in the piazza, like a word that had been preserved in old wax and now set in the sun. Father Ricci's eyes flicked briefly toward the villagers who had gathered, then back to the man before him. "By whom?" The answer arrived like a stone dropped quietly into still water.
"By those who hear of eclipses and sudden panic," Father Lorenzo replied. "By those who read reports of people claiming to hear voices in the earth and see shapes where there should be none. By those who know that certain disorders of the spirit have a way of returning in rural places where old stories never quite die." The whispers around the square sharpened. Matteo felt them as much as heard them. Words like madness and curse flittered at the edges of conscious thought. Beside him, Sandro shifted his weight, pressing closer as though the stranger's mere presence made the air colder. Luca did not move at all. His stare remained fixed on Father Lorenzo, his expression unreadable. But Matteo sensed the ripple of his thoughts, quick and guarded, slipping like fish beneath the surface where no one could see. Reports, voices, disorders of the spirit. The phrases floated around Matteo, snagging on memories, the inhuman silence of the eclipse,
the chorus of whispers rising from the stones, the child on the rooftop saying he couldn't find the door. The way the village had never quite returned to normal afterwards. People spoke in lower tones now. Crosses made their way into nervous fingers more often. Old superstitions, once told as jokes, were suddenly repeated with serious eyes. Father Lorenzo stood at the center of all of it, calm as a man in a library, as if this were nothing more than a puzzle laid out for him to solve. "I have experience with such matters," he added, almost gently. Matteo's skin prickled. The phrase carried a heavy shadow, one that stretched backward through time. He did not know yet that somewhere in Rome, in dusty archives, there were boxes filled with trial records and confessions written in careful ink, all bearing Father Lorenzo's name in the margins. He did not yet understand that this man lived with ghosts of his own, cases where things had gone too far, where the church had stepped in too late or too harshly. All Matteo felt was the instinctive fear of prey recognizing a hunter. The parish priest hesitated, then inclined his head, the movement wavering around the edges. "Of course, you must be tired from your journey. We can speak inside." He gestured toward the small stone church. Father Lorenzo's gaze slid briefly over the faces in the square before he followed. For the briefest moment, his eyes passed over Matteo, Luca, and Sandro. It was no more than a glance, but it felt like a fine needle passing through fabric, threading some invisible mark into them. Then the church door closed. The piazza exhaled. Conversations burst out in low, urgent tones. What did he mean, disorders of the spirit? Had he come because of the eclipse? Because of the dreams? Because old Signora de Santis woke screaming 2 nights in a row, saying the dead were walking past her window?
Matteo listened without wanting to. The whispers, already restless, snagged on the villagers' fears like burrs on wool. Fragments of older words rose with them. Streghe, stregoni, inquisizione. Shadows of history twisted themselves into the present, binding the 2 centuries together in a knot that tightened with each breath. "We need to go," Luca's thoughts slid against Matteo's ear, cool and urgent. Sandro was already moving, pulled by some instinct deeper than understanding. The boys slipped away along the side of the church, past the narrow alley that led between houses and out toward the hillside. No one stopped them. Adults were too busy staring at the closed church door, imagining what the 2 priests were saying to each other inside. They climbed until the village was spread below them like a rough map carved into the mountain. Matteo could see the bus still parked near the entrance road, its driver smoking and glancing toward the piazza with the wary curiosity of someone who wanted to leave but knew he'd be asked questions if he did. The boys found a spot among the olive trees, out of sight from the square. The earth here felt different, less trampled, more open, as if the centuries had had room to breathe. Still, the whispers were there. They were always there now. No matter where Matteo went, he heard them at the edge of thought. Names, pleas, fragments of ancient terror. Luca sank onto a low stone and scrubbed a hand over his face. Sandro remained standing, arms wrapped around himself, eyes darting from tree to tree. "He's here for us," Sandro thought, the words ragged as if dragged from his throat. Luca shook his head, slow and deliberate. "He's here for what we might become." The distinction did not soothe. Matteo lowered himself onto the ground, feeling the roughness of dry grass through his jeans. "What are we then?" he wanted to ask, but the answer already pulsed in the soil beneath him. Not just cursed, not just afflicted. The whispers clung to them because they could hear. They called because someone was finally listening after too long in the dark. The dead did not care about the living's labels. Witch, prophet, madman, saint. To them, any ear willing to listen was a door. Luca stared toward the village church, where the new priest sat in shadowed conversation. There was history in his eyes, more than his 13 years should have allowed. This has happened before, he thought. Sandro's breath hitched. Before when? Luca's gaze turned inward, following a trail of memory that did not belong to him alone. It carried the taste of old dust, of pages turned by careful fingers, of whispered warnings half believed. He read about them in one of the places they sent me, his thoughts continued, slower now, as if pulling words from a deep well. They gave us chores in the archives. I found a file. It was supposed to be sealed, but they left it on a desk. Trials from the north, early 1700s. Boys accused of witchcraft, not girls. Boys. They said the devil wanted them most because no one expected it. Matteo's heart thudded, each beat frustratingly human in the face of such old horror. What happened to them? He asked, though he could already hear the answer whispering from the earth. Rope creaking, flames licking, water closing over lungs that did not yet know how to die. What always happens, Luca's thought came, flat as stone. The villagers were afraid. The church was afraid. Fear never needs much to turn into fire. The air around them grew heavier. The olive leaves stilled. Matteo could feel them now, shapes pressed into the soil beneath San Damiano and 100 villages like it. Children whose names had been scraped away by time, whose stories survived only in the language of scars and rumors and uncomfortable silences when certain topics arose. He understood, suddenly, the quality in Father Lorenzo's eyes. It was not simple cruelty. It was the calm of someone who believed he was preventing a greater darkness, someone who had seen things he could not explain, blamed them on demons, and built his life on stopping them. To a man like that, boys who heard the dead were not people needing help. They were evidence. Sandro made a small, choked sound. Matteo turned quickly. The younger boy's face had gone very pale. His eyes were focused not on the village, not on the church, but on the ground between his shoes. "They're here," Sandro thought, voice almost inaudible. "The ones from before. They don't like him." Matteo swallowed hard. The whispers around Sandro thickened, as if drawn to the sensitivity of his skin. He could almost feel them himself now, a cluster of presence just out of sight, pressing against the barrier between worlds. Their anger was not hot and wild like the living's. It was cold, heavy, patient. Left too long without justice, it had congealed into something that waited for any chance to be heard. What do they want? Matteo thought, half afraid of the answer. Sandro's shoulders hunched. His lower lip trembled. To be remembered, to be avenged, to not be buried twice. A wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of dust and distant smoke. For a moment, Matteo imagined he could see faces in the shifting patches of light and shadow, quick impressions of eyes and mouths, children staring from the other side of a cracked mirror. Down in the piazza, the church bell rang once, sharp and decisive. Conversation over. Father Lorenzo emerged with Father Ricci at his side. Whatever they had discussed had left a new set to the parish priest's jaw, a new tightness at the corners of his eyes. The stranger's stride remained unchanged, purposeful, controlled, but now he carried a leather folder under one arm, its edges bulging slightly where too many documents had been forced inside. He began visiting houses that afternoon. He did it politely, no pounding on doors, no shouting. He knocked, introduced himself, and asked to hear what people had seen during the eclipse, what they had heard since. He listened with measured attentiveness, taking notes in a neat hand. To some he offered prayers, to others suggestions for more sleep or less wine. But always his questions circled the same points: voices, visions, children. Especially children. Matteo, Luca, and Sandro stayed away at first. They kept to the upper terraces, pretending to work in the vineyard while their minds stretched thin to catch every fragment of news drifting up from the lanes below. Each report reached them twice, once in the living words passed from neighbor to neighbor, and once echoed in the murmurs of the dead, who watched with the weary interest of people who had seen this pattern repeat too many times. When Father Lorenzo finally turned his steps towards the vineyard path, they knew before they saw him. The earth tightened. The whispers sharpened.
Sandro's fingers dug into Matteo's sleeve. Luca straightened, eyes narrowing, shoulders squaring as if bracing for impact. The inquisitor of this century was not carrying chains or torches. He brought questions instead of shackles, a crucifix instead of a sword, a leather folder instead of a brand. But the shape of him fit too neatly into the space once occupied by men whose arrival meant endings. His shadow fell long across the dirt path as he began to climb toward them.
The church of San Damiano sul Monte was old, but not ancient. Its stones were no more than 4 centuries worn, its foundations restored twice, its roof patched so many times that every tile was a different shade of red. But beneath the church, beneath the layers of plaster and history and carefully forgotten records, lay something older, much older than the villagers remembered, older even than the stories they whispered in fear. Matteo did not know this yet. He only knew that when Father Lorenzo's shadow stretched toward the vineyard earlier that day, something inside the ground recoiled. The whispers had tightened, retreating like a breath sucked inward, as if they feared being noticed. And when the priest came within 15 paces of the place where the 3 boys had been standing, Luca had grabbed Matteo and Sandro by their elbows and pulled them back through the vines without a word. They spent the rest of the day hiding in the terraces, moving between olive trees and low stone walls until Father Lorenzo's footsteps faded and the sky dimmed to the color of metal. Only then did they dare return home, each to their own uneasy walls, each to their own shadows. Now night had fallen. A thin moon lay over the village like a blade of silver. Matteo sat on his small bed in the attic, listening to the whispers threading through the darkness. They were quieter tonight, but not gone. They rarely left now that they had woken. Instead, they murmured low, like the rumble of river water under a bridge, carrying distant names and broken memories he could not yet decipher. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. The wind shifted. And then it came, a new whisper, nearer than any before, rising from the floorboards beneath Matteo's bare feet. Come. The single word carried no threat, only insistence. It wrapped around him with the chill of an unseen hand gripping his wrist. He closed his eyes. He didn't want to answer, but the voice pressed again. Come. He rose, quietly, so as not to wake his mother. The house creaked softly, but no one stirred. He slipped down the attic ladder and crept past his parents' room, then through the kitchen and out into the moonlit courtyard. The gate squealed faintly as he pushed it open. He winced, waited, listened. Nothing moved. The whisper came again, drifting from somewhere below the village. This way. Matteo followed. Down the cobbled lanes, past the shuttered bakery and the empty butcher's stall, past the fountain that no longer flowed, past the houses with lantern light dim behind curtains. San Damiano slept uneasy, but it slept. It did not see the boy slipping through its shadows. The whisper guided him to the church. Its heavy wooden door was closed, but one of the small side doors, the one seldom used except by Father Ricci, stood slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness gaped between door and frame. Matteo approached slowly. The whisper hovered on his skin like static. Inside. He pushed the door open. The church interior was colder than outside. The air carried the smells of stone, incense, and dust. The altar glowed faintly with moonlight filtered through stained glass. The rows of pews stood silent and severe, their carved backs casting long black bars across the floor. Matteo had never been in the church alone at night. The space felt hollow and echoing, as though the prayers spoken inside it had seeped into the walls and now hummed faintly beneath the quiet. But the whisper pulled him forward. He passed the altar, past the statue of St. Michael spearing a demon, past the little alcove where villagers lit candles for lost loved ones. Only 2 candles burned tonight, one nearly melted to its base. Come. The voice led him to the back of the church, where a narrow wooden door stood half hidden behind a column.
Matteo remembered seeing Father Ricci slip through it once, years ago, during a mass when a gust of wind had blown out all the altar candles at once. The villagers said the room behind it was just a storage place for linens, cleaning supplies, and the old confessional screen. But when Matteo pushed the door open, the air beyond felt different, older. He stepped through. The storage room was dim, lit only by the light filtering through the church door behind him. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with brass candlesticks, boxes of hymn books, dusty votive holders, jars of oil. Cobwebs clung to corners. It smelled of wax and old wood.
Then the whisper drifted again. Down. Matteo scanned the floor. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed a line, faint but straight, cutting across the dusty tiles. A seam. A hidden door. His heart thudded in his chest. The floor panel had no handle, no hinge, no lock. It was carved to blend seamlessly with the surrounding stone. But the whisper pushed against him like a breath at his back. Open it. He knelt. His fingers traced the line. The stone felt warm under his touch, as though someone had been here recently. He pressed lightly. The panel gave a little. Pressed again. The stone shifted, then lifted slightly, as if it had been waiting for someone who could hear. Matteo pulled it open. Cool, stale air rose from the darkness below. A narrow stone staircase descended into blackness. It looked bottomless. Come. He swallowed hard and stepped down. 1, 2, 10, 20. The door above him closed on its own. The darkness deepened. The whispers grew louder. Finally, he reached the bottom. The chamber was small and circular, no bigger than a shepherd's hut. The walls were rough stone, carved with faint symbols that danced just outside easy recognition. A single table stood at the center, made from dark, heavy wood scarred by age, and upon the table lay a book, thick, leather-bound. Its cover cracked and blackened at the edges. A metal clasp sealed it shut, engraved with a symbol Matteo had never seen, a circle intersected by 3 lines that radiated like rays of a sun. The whisper rose in a chorus now. Take it. Matteo approached cautiously. The air around the book felt denser, like the stillness before a storm. The shadows in the room leaned in, drawn to its presence. His hand hovered above the cover. The moment his fingers touched the leather, heat pulsed through it. Not burning, alive. The clasp clicked open on its own. The book's pages loosened, fluttering slightly as though exhaling after centuries of being sealed. A torrent of whispers flooded Matteo's mind. Names, dates, tortures, fires. Boys younger than him dragged from their homes. Boys his age accused of curses. Boys older than Luca thrown into cells without light. Boys who could see what others could not, whose gifts had been mistaken for sins. He gasped and staggered back. The whispers did not stop. They pressed against him, memories bleeding through the walls of time. He saw a mountain path lit by torches, a child tied to a stake, a priest raising a book that looked exactly like this one, voices chanting, a scream swallowed by flame. Matteo clutched his head. The whispers sharpened into one word: remember. He forced himself to breathe, to look down, to focus. The book lay open now, its pages filled with cramped script, sketches of symbols, diagrams of rituals, descriptions of stregoni, male witches. Not monsters, protectors. Children marked not by evil, but by sight. The Grimoire of San Pellegrino, a lost text whispered about in old regional folklore, a book said to contain the last memories of the witch boys, written before the church hunted them to near extinction. Matteo's pulse hammered. This book wasn't a curse. It was a history, a warning, a key, a map. He touched the page again, carefully this time. The ink gleamed faintly in the dimness, as though reflecting firelight from another century. The whisper surged again. "Find the others." He snapped the book shut, heart racing. The clasp sealed itself with a metallic click. He pressed the heavy volume to his chest. When he climbed the steps, the door above opened before he reached it, as though granting passage. The storage room was unchanged. The church beyond was still silent. But Matteo was not. He no longer felt alone. He felt watched, guided, chosen. He stepped out into the night. The moon was higher now, the shadows sharper. As he hurried through the lanes, the whispers swirled around him like wind through leaves. Not warning, not fear, expectation. When he reached the vineyard, Luca and Sandro were already waiting, as though something had called them too. Luca's eyes locked onto the book instantly, widening in a way Matteo had never seen. "Where did you find that?" Matteo didn't answer. He simply held out the grimoire. And in that moment, the whispers rose with one voice. "It begins again." The book did not like to be opened. Matteo discovered this the moment he and the others sat in the vineyard, with the night thick around them and dew beginning to gather on the leaves. The Grimoire of San Pellegrino lay on a flat stone between them like a sleeping animal, its leather skin dull in the moonlight, the strange clasp glinting faintly. Every time he reached toward it, something inside him recoiled. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a sense that once he crossed this line, there would be no stepping back. Luca watched in silence, knees drawn up, elbows balanced loosely on them. Sandro sat so close to Matteo that their shoulders touched, his thin frame tense, eyes flicking from the book to the shadows and back again. The whispers were louder here, circling them in an invisible ring. Old voices pressed against the air as if crowding toward the table where a trial was about to be read. "Open it," the chorus urged. Matteo hooked his fingers around the metal clasp. It was warm, as if someone else had just held it. The symbol engraved on it, the circle crossed by 3 radiating lines, seemed to pulse under his touch. It reminded him of the eclipse, of that ring of unholy light. He pressed gently. The clasp loosened with a soft final click, like a lock giving way after centuries. The cover lifted. A breath of cold, dry air rose from the pages, carrying the faint scent of old smoke, dust, and something metallic like rust or dried blood. The handwriting inside crowded the page in tight, slanted lines. Brown ink faded at the edges, but still legible, as if the words refused to decay. At first, Matteo saw only a flood of unfamiliar Latin, the letters dancing. Then the whispers curved around his mind, nudging his understanding, pushing him into alignment with the voice that had written these words long ago. "We, the last, set down this record so that when they come again, someone will know." Matteo's heart kicked. The sentence didn't arrive in his eyes first, but in his bones, as though he was recalling a memory rather than reading text. He read on. "In the year of our Lord 1689, during the great persecutions in the valley of San Pellegrino, it was found that not only women, but boys bore the marks." The marks. His fingers tightened on the page. Symbols filled the margins, drawn eyes, spirals, small figures with circles around their heads. Under them, notes named 3 signs, those who heard what others could not, those whose thoughts touched the living, those whose skin burned when spirits passed near. Matteo swallowed. He hears, Luca thought, a faint wryness hidden under the tension. "You speak," Matteo sent back, hardly aware of forming the thought. Sandro hugged his knees closer. "They touch me," his mind whispered, small and shaken. "Always." The 3 signs. 3 boys sitting under the mountain sky. On the next page, a sketch of a building appeared, tall, severe, its bell tower rising like a finger of stone. The words beneath it labeled it clearly, Cathedral of San Pellegrino. Matteo had heard of it. Everyone in the region had.
It stood in the larger town 2 valleys away, built on the ruins of something older. People said miracles had happened there once. People also said other things, darker things, though those stories only came out after too much wine. The script beneath the drawing darkened, letters pressed harder into the page, as if the hand writing them had trembled with anger. Rome decreed that our kind were of the devil, yet they did not know what we kept beneath their altars. Long before the first stone of the cathedral was laid, the earth there cracked and burned. From that pit rose whispers that were not of human dead, nor of any saint. The boy's eyes lifted as one. The earth under them seemed to shift, remembering. A slow, deep shudder traveled up from the core of the hill into their bones. Sandro laid a soft, strangled sound. "It's warm," he thought, pressing his palm to the ground. "It shouldn't be." The night was cold, the stone chilled, but beneath the surface a distant heat pulsed, steady and ancient. Matteo read on, each word sinking in like a nail. They called it hellfire and tried to close it with prayers. But the fire was not hell's. It was older, hungry for bargains. It spoke in the nights to those who could hear. It promised power in exchange for blood and obedience. Some of our number listened, and they were lost. Others defied it. They used their gifts to hold it back, binding it beneath stones, beneath altars, beneath the feet of men who never knew they walked over jaws. We were not devils. We were jailers. Jailers, keepers of something locked away. The whispers around them rose in tone, as if they too remembered shackles and bargains and nights when fire licked the undersides of cloisters.
But the church saw only what it feared. Boys who knew secrets, boys who heard voices, boys whose hands burned when evil came close. They took us one by one. Trials, confessions beaten from us, ropes, flames. The fire beneath the cathedral laughed as our guards were killed. Our blood sealed a pact we did not make. The script faltered. The ink blobbed in places, as though tears or shaking hands had interrupted the flow. It will seek new ones. It will always seek 3. Hearer, speaker, touched. It thirsts for them, for us. If it can twist them to its will, it will rise. If they instead choose freely to stand as we did, it may be held. The tie is blood. The tie is will. Matteo's throat was dry. The valley seemed to tilt around them. For a moment he had the dizzy sensation that the hillside, the vineyard, the whole village were perched on the lid of a vast, buried thing, and that lid was beginning to rattle. Luca's thoughts brushed his like a cold hand. "This is what he has hunted," he murmured. "Not just people like us. The signs, the pattern. He thinks we are the crack in the wall." Matteo imagined Father Lorenzo standing in some archive years ago, reading these same words, his face lit by lamplight, his features tightening as he underlined phrases about boys and bargains and pits of unholy fire. To a mind like his, the conclusion would have been simple: destroy the pattern, save the world. To the dead beneath their feet, it had been a little more complicated. More text filled the page. Rituals, warnings, descriptions of how to sense the place where the earth thinned and the fire pressed close. Notes on how the 3 signs must stand together, willingly, to renew the binding. Another drawing of the cathedral's crypt, a series of arches leading to a dark opening half hidden in the sketch, as if the artist had been afraid even to draw it fully. Sandro shivered, his thoughts barely a whisper. "It burns under that place. I can feel it even from here. It's like when you stand too close to a stove, but under your skin." Matteo turned another page. Entries grew shorter. The handwriting deteriorated. The last lines were jagged, words crammed into what little space remained on the parchment, as though the writer knew they were almost out of time.
They come for us now. We hear their boots above. The bells ring not for mass, but for death. Fire below, fire above. We do not know which will take us first. We failed. We did not teach the next ones. We did not live long enough. If you read this, know that the pact does not care for centuries. It stretches. It waits. It needs 3. The choice will be yours. The final word broke off halfway down the last page, a stroke of ink trailing into nothing. The space beneath it remained blank. No neat signature, no date, just an abrupt silence. The whispers surged at once. Matteo slammed the book shut. The night around them felt suddenly intimate, suffocating. The stars seemed farther away, the sky lower, the village smaller, punier, perched atop a history it had never bargained for. He stared at the closed grimoire, heart pounding. Under the cathedral of San Pellegrino, something burned that wasn't supposed to. Once, boys like them had held it in check. Then they'd been murdered in the name of righteousness. Now the thing beneath the stones waited for its pattern to repeat. 3 boys, 3 signs, a new chance. Luca broke the thick silence, his thought a low thread. He will go there, he said, to the cathedral. If he knows of this book, he knows of that place. Men like him are drawn to the deepest cracks. He will want to close it his way. Sandro hugged himself tighter, his thin shoulders shaking. "What is his way?" he whispered. Luca did not answer. He didn't need to. The whispers in the soil provided the missing images. Chains, exorcisms that looked like beatings, children labeled possessed until they broke, the fire below fed by the fear above.
Matteo closed his eyes. The path ahead unfolded in his mind like a map traced by someone else's hand. Father Lorenzo would push toward the cathedral, hungry for proof. The fire beneath would stir, sensing him, sensing them. If they did nothing, the old pattern would repeat. Boys accused, boys punished, boys silenced. The thing in the pit would seep a little more into the cracks. If they did something, they might end worse. The grimoire pressed heavy in his hands. "Remember," the chorus of the dead urged. "We did not die for nothing." A distant bell echoed over the valley, soft and late. Not the church in San Damiano this time, but something farther, fainter. The cathedral's bell, carried on the quiet night air. Matteo opened his eyes. "We have to see it," he thought, barely daring to form the words. "The place in the book, the crypt, the pit. If this is about us, we can't stay up here hiding in vines." Luca's jaw tightened. "It's not a crypt," Sandro whispered, shivering, gaze unfocused as he felt something far away. "It's a wound." The vineyard fell still. Dawn did not bring relief. Mist clung to the lower terraces, wrapping the trunks of olive trees in pale gauze. The village stirred sluggishly, as if each house had slept badly. Father Lorenzo attended early mass with Father Ricci, his voice calm, his sermon gentle, speaking of tests and faith and trusting in God even when the sky darkens unexpectedly. People left with heads bowed, feeling both soothed and unsettled. He announced he would be visiting the cathedral in San Pellegrino that afternoon, to consult records, to pray, to seek guidance. No one argued. Priests went to cathedrals. It was normal. But nothing about the way the earth lurched under Matteo's feet as those words left Father Lorenzo's mouth felt normal. The whispers flared, flickering like shadows in a strong wind. "They will meet," they breathed, "the hunter and the fire. You must reach it first." By midday, Matteo, Luca, and Sandro were already on the road out of the village, the grimoire wrapped in an old cloth and hidden in Matteo's backpack. They walked fast, keeping to the narrow paths between fields rather than the main asphalt road where a priest's sharp gaze might catch them from a passing car. The hills rose and fell around them,
green and gold under the pale sun. The world looked ordinary. Tractors in the distance, farmers hunched over rows of crops, laundry snapping on lines. But beneath that thin layer, another Italy breathed. A lattice of buried bones, old trial records, burned witches, forgotten miracles and miseries. The boys moved through both at once.
Sandro grew quieter the closer they drew to San Pellegrino. His steps faltered. Sweat purled at his hairline despite the cool air. It hurts, he thought finally, throat tight, like standing too close to a fire you can't see. It's under everything. Under the road, under the fields. It's all connected to that place. Luca put a hand on his shoulder, steady and firm, and kept him moving. The town appeared in the distance, a cluster of gray stone and red roofs huddled around a hilltop dominated by the cathedral. It rose from the rock like something grown rather than built, its spire a finger pointing accusingly at heaven. Pigeons wheeled around its bell tower. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became. A subtle heat pushed up from the ground, not enough to warm their skin, but enough to make the air feel thick, as if they were walking through breath. The whispers changed. In San Damiano, they had been scattered, confused, a crowd of voices speaking over each other. Here they were focused, cohesive, like a choir trained to one song. They pulsed in time with Matteo's heartbeat, not in words at first, but in a deep, rhythmic hum that seemed to sync with something beneath the cathedral's foundations. We're late, Matteo thought wildly, though he had no reason to know. No, Luca's thought cut clean through his panic. We're here before him. That's all that matters for now. They slipped into the town with their heads down. No one paid much attention to three boys among many others. School had let out early. Children ran across the square. Old men sat in doorways with radios tuned to football commentary. Life thrummed unaware over the lid of a buried furnace. The cathedral loomed above them. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The stone around the main doors bore centuries of weather, pitted and smoothed by the hands of countless parishioners. Statues of saints watched from niches, their faces worn almost featureless. The heavy doors themselves were carved with scenes of judgment and redemption. Beneath one panel, Matteo noticed, almost hidden under a swirl of decorative vine, the same symbol as on the grimoire's clasp, a circle intersected by 3 lines. His skin crawled. They stepped inside. The cool dimness of the nave wrapped around them. Light filtered through stained glass in colored shafts, painting saints and martyrs on the stone floor. The ceiling arched high above like an upturned ship. Candles flickered near side altars. The air smelled of incense and old stone. And beneath it all, the heat, subtle but constant, radiating up from the flagstones. Sandro flinched with every step. It's louder here, he thought, pressing his hands to his temples. They're crowded around something, pushing against it, like a lid. I can feel it bulging. Matteo's gaze swept the interior. People knelt scattered among the pews. A priest moved near the main altar, head bowed. No one looked their way. The grimoire pulsed faintly against his back, like a second alien heartbeat. The book's drawings of the crypt rose in his mind, overlaying themselves on the present. A stairway near the side, a narrow door, arches carved into rock. He scanned the church and saw it. A gated passage to the left of the main altar, half hidden in shadow, marked simply with a small sign, Crypta. Luca's eyes followed his. Found it. His thought carried a grim twist. They waited until no one stood near, then slipped toward the gate. A chain and simple padlock barred the way. For visitors, the crypt opened only on certain days, under supervision. For them, something else moved. As they approached, the whispers surged. The lock clicked. The chain loosened. Metal did not shatter. Nothing dramatic happened. It simply slipped open as if someone had just unlocked it. The boys exchanged a look. Sandro trembled. Luca's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Down, the underground voices urged, eager and afraid all at once.
They descended into the fire beneath the cathedral.
The crypt swallowed them one step at a time. At first, the descent felt ordinary, just a cool stone staircase spiraling into dimness. But the deeper Matteo went, the more the air thickened. It was not temperature, though the air did grow warmer. It was not darkness, though the shadows grew deeper. It was pressure, something pushing against his chest, as if the cathedral above were sinking slowly onto his ribs. The stairs finally opened into a long corridor. Arches lined each side, leading into small alcoves where old tombs lay sealed with stone slabs. Rusted iron rings protruded from walls. Cobwebs clung like pale veins. The air tasted of minerals and centuries. The whispers were no longer separate voices. They had merged into one low chant, a pulse that seemed to move with the building itself, rising and falling like a creature breathing in its sleep. Sandro flinched every few steps, his breath catching as if invisible fingers brushed his shoulders. Luca walked with slow purpose, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. Matteo tried to keep his heartbeat steady, but the grimoire in his backpack seemed to thrum with urgency, urging him forward. They followed the corridor until it narrowed abruptly into a doorway carved into the rock. Beyond it stretched a chamber larger than any tomb should have been, circular, domed, but uneven, as though the builders had carved only as much as they dared from the earth. At its center lay a sunken pit surrounded by 3 ancient pillars. The floor around the pit was darker stone than the rest, almost black, as if it had been scorched from underneath. Matteo felt the heat rise from that pit before he reached its edge. Sandro made a thin, broken sound. It wasn't pain or fear, not exactly. It was recognition. The pit responded, glowing faintly from far, far below the earth, not with flame, with something deeper, more molten, more ancient than fire.
"It's alive," Sandro thought shakily. Luca's thoughts snapped like a snare. "Don't touch the edge." Matteo stepped forward anyway. He couldn't help himself. Something in the heat called to him, not pleasantly but inexorably, like a rope pulling from inside his chest. He stopped only when he reached the rim, where the stone had worn into a smooth curve. Beneath him, the pit descended into a red-gold glow, pulsing like the heart of a sleeping giant buried under the mountain. He saw movement there, shadows twisting like limbs in liquid metal, a shape rising, then falling, then rising again. It knew they were here. The whispers around them exploded. 3 signs, 3 again, chosen, needed, bound. Matteo stumbled back. The pit flared. A wave of hot air rolled up the chamber walls, making the ancient carvings flicker in the dimness. He had the dizzy sensation that if he took one more step toward the pit, he would fall into its hunger forever. Sandro collapsed to his knees. His fingers dug into the floor until his knuckles went white. "They're touching me, all of them at once. They think I'm theirs. They think—" He gasped as if someone had pressed a hand over his mouth. Luca knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders, grounding him. "It can't claim you," he said, sharp with iron certainty. "It needs all 3. You're not alone." But even Luca's confidence wavered at the edges. Matteo swallowed. His throat felt raw, scraped from the inside. The pit's heat intensified with every passing second. The domed ceiling overhead vibrated faintly, as though the cathedral itself were responding to the thing beneath it. The grimoire burned through his backpack. Open it. No. Open it now. Matteo resisted. His fingers curled around the straps, fighting the pressure rising inside him. But the voices, dead, unborn, buried, burned, coiled around him like smoke. He pulled the book free. Luca's eyes snapped toward him, alarm flashing. But the grimoire had already begun to open. The clasp clicked free with a metallic sigh. Pages fluttered of their own will, stopping suddenly near the middle, where a full-page diagram filled the parchment. 3 figures forming a circle around a pit, hands outstretched. a line of symbols beneath them, and a warning scrawled in dark ink. Only the willing seal it. Only the broken free it. Matteo stared at the ink. Broken. He didn't understand, but something inside him whispered that someone in this trio was not whole enough to bind anything. Someone was cracked at the edges. Sandro raised his head suddenly, eyes wide and empty. "It wants one," he whispered in thought. "Just one to start. It doesn't care which." Luca pulled him closer, shielding him with his body. "No one is going to the edge," he thought fiercely. The pit flashed. Heat surged. Something moved inside it. A claw? A hand? A memory? Matteo couldn't tell. He felt dizzy. The grimoire trembled in his grip. Then footsteps echoed down the corridor behind them. Slow, measured, inevitable. A tall shape appeared in the doorway, framed in shadow. Father Lorenzo. His face was pale, illuminated from below by the pit's glow. He did not look surprised. He did not look frightened. He looked vindicated, like a man who had followed a trail for years and finally reached its end. "So," he said without speaking, his presence filling the chamber like frost, "this is the truth beneath it all." The boys froze. He walked closer. His shoes crunched on the fractured stone. His coat brushed the dusty air. His eyes gleamed with a feverish righteousness. Behind enlightenment, there was something else. Relief.
"I was right," he whispered through thought, though his lips barely moved. "It was never delusion, never folklore. There has always been a fire beneath this land, a pact, a corruption, and you—" His gaze fell on the three boys. "You are its heirs." Matteo felt the pit flare at the words. Luca stood, placing himself between the priest and Sandro. "We're not what you think," Luca thought, teeth bared without opening his mouth. Father Lorenzo's thoughts sharpened. "You hear voices, you speak in minds, you feel the pull of the dead, and you come exactly where the rituals say you must stand." "No," Matteo whispered in his mind, but the word felt small. The priest extended a hand, not to help, but to judge. He reached toward the pit as if presenting a long-awaited confession. "You're not victims," he thought. "You're the cracks through which this poison seeps." "No," Matteo thought again, more desperate. Luca moved one step forward. Sandro's breath came in small, broken gasps. The pit pulsed again, harder this time, as though responding to the conflict. Then Father Lorenzo's thoughts cut through the chamber like a blade. "One of you has chosen already." The words struck Matteo's mind like a blow. Luca's shoulders locked. Sandro's entire body went rigid. Matteo's thoughts stumbled. Chosen what? The priest's lips curled, not in a smile, but in a grim acknowledgement. To serve it. He turned, not to Sandro, not to Matteo, to Luca. Matteo's stomach dropped. Luca's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. Not out loud, not in thought. Matteo felt the truth slide between them like a knife. Luca had known things before they did.
He had found them quickly. He had led them here. He had always been able to speak into minds without effort. But the whispering fire, had it touched him first? Had it seeded something inside him when he was small, alone in an orphanage, terrified of his own abilities? Father Lorenzo stepped closer. Matteo saw Luca's hands tremble, then tighten into fists. "You're wrong," Matteo sent, though he didn't know if he spoke to Father Lorenzo or to Luca himself. The pit flared. A sound like a distant roar rolled up from below. Sandro cried out silently, clutching his chest. Then Luca moved. Not toward the pit, not toward Matteo, toward Father Lorenzo. For a heartbeat, Matteo thought he was attacking the priest, but Luca stopped halfway between them. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough that Matteo understood. He wasn't attacking. He was surrendering. He was giving himself over. Matteo felt it like a blow, Luca's will bending slightly toward the pit's call, drawn not by evil, but by desperation, loneliness, the weight of being hunted his entire life. Father Lorenzo inhaled sharply, victorious. Sandro sobbed without sound. Matteo dropped to his knees, unable to breathe. The grimoire flipped open on its own, landing on the final page, the one with no writing except a single half-formed word. Betray. A crack split the air, not in the book, in the floor.
The stone around the pit fractured. Heat roared upward like a dragon's breath. Luca stood at the edge now, eyes reflecting the molten light below. He was neither falling nor resisting. He was choosing. Matteo reached for him, thoughts screaming, "Don't!" Luca finally looked at him. For the first time, his thoughts did not reach Matteo. His voice did. "I don't have anything left to lose." Then he stepped closer to the edge. The betrayal began, and the fire below answered. The glow from the pit swelled, painting the crypt walls in molten colors. Shapes rose within it, ill-defined and shifting, like limbs half-remembered from a nightmare. A sound came with them, a low moan that was not quite human nor entirely unearthly, like a choir singing in a language stretched too far. Luca stood straighter at the edge, shoulders squared, face caught between the light from below and the shadow above. The heat lifted his hair from his forehead. Sweat traced slow lines down his temples. His eyes met the red-gold glow without flinching. For a heartbeat, it felt as if he and the fire regarded each other as equals. Then the grimoire snapped shut in Matteo's hands as if slapped by an unseen palm.
The noise cracked through the chamber. The glow faltered. The sound from the pit hiccuped and died back to a trapped roar. The figure in the stone dimmed, its edges smoking. Matteo gasped, as though the book had punched the air back into his chest. The whispers around them rose in overlapping panic. Not yet. Too soon. It wants him. Do not let it take him. Sandro pushed himself up, trembling, eyes wide and glassy. He whispered in thought that they were pressing on him, pulling at him, trying to drag him toward the edge along with Luca. His nails had broken where he clawed at the floor to stay still. Father Lorenzo recovered first. His hand left the cross and closed into a fist at his side. His mind, when it rolled through the chamber, was no longer cool and measured. It burned with a harsh, brittle conviction. Enough, his thoughts snapped, cutting through the lingering echoes of the pit. This ends now. He strode forward and seized Luca by the arm, pulling him backward from the rim. The contact seemed to break something. Luca's knees buckled. He sagged, suddenly boneless, as if whatever had been holding him upright came from the pit and had now let go. Father Lorenzo did not let him fall. He held the boy with surprising strength for a man of his age and build. "You will not give yourself to it," he thought, and for a moment there was no triumph in the words, only raw desperation. "I will not allow it another generation." Matteo tried to stand. His legs shook. Sandro crawled toward him, fingers clinging to his sleeve. The heat in the chamber eased, though it did not vanish. It retreated like a beast forced back behind bars, waiting for another weakness in the wall. The priest's gaze moved from Luca to Matteo to Sandro, weighing them as if for execution, for sacrifice, for salvation, perhaps all three at once. "You are coming with me," he said aloud this time, his voice hoarse but steady. "All of you." They were too stunned, too exhausted to fight.
Later, Matteo would not clearly remember the path back up. The climb from crypt to nave unfolded in fragments, Sandro stumbling and being half-carried, Luca walking, eyes down, saying nothing, Father Lorenzo's grip on him like manacles. The church above was empty now.
The last of the faithful had gone home hours ago. Only candles near the side altars burned, throwing restless light across the stone. Outside, the town of San Pellegrino slept. The priest did not wake it. He marched the boys through side corridors and out a back door that opened into a narrow alley. The air was colder here, away from the cathedral's buried heat. Stars glittered above the dark slope of roofs. The boys' breath fogged in front of them. Matteo heard whispers rising from every stone they stepped on. They asked questions. They offered warnings. They named old judgments. The word trial rolled through them with the heavy familiarity of something done too many times. Father Lorenzo led them to a small annex beside the cathedral, a building of plain stone with barred windows and a single wooden door. It smelled of damp and iron, a place for storage, for records, for things that needed to be kept close to the church and far from the world, or a place to hold what frightened people until the morning. He pushed them inside. The room was bare except for a bench, an old wooden table, and a set of rusted chains hanging from an iron ring set into the wall. There were no icons, no crosses, no candles. The only light came from a narrow, high window that looked out onto nothing but darkness. Father Lorenzo shut the door behind them, but did not lock it immediately. He stood with his back to it, breathing hard, his face a mask of controlled fury and troubled awe. "You think you are cursed," he said, voice low. "You are worse than cursed. You are useful." Luca's head lifted, eyes shadowed. Useful to what? Matteo thought, the words raw. To whatever is down there, the priest replied without hesitation, to whatever has used boys like you for centuries, bending your gifts to hold its prison while corrupting your souls. It is not mercy to leave you in that bond. It is not mercy to let you continue. Sandro muttered, in thought that they never chose this. The fire had reached up, the gifts had come without invitation. Father Lorenzo's gaze flicked to him. "And yet you came to its mouth," he said, "3 of you together, as if answering a call, as if fulfilling a script written long before your births." His eyes dropped to the grimoire clutched in Matteo's hands. "That book is evidence," he continued, "proof of patterns the church buried because they did not understand. They thought burning the boys would be enough. It wasn't. You are the echo. You and others like you." Matteo's skin crawled at the implication. Others. Father Lorenzo nodded as though he had heard the thought. "I have followed stories of you across this country," he said. "Quiet little towns, strange phenomena, boys who vanish after accidents no one explains well. For every case that survives on paper, there are 3 that never leave the whispers. But the pattern is always the same. 3 signs: fire in the ground, fear." He stepped closer to the table and placed both hands on it, leaning forward. "I have seen what happens when no one intervenes," he said. "Villages devoured from the inside, people torn apart in ways no knife can explain, whole families cursed by something that began in one child and spread like contagion. Call me a hunter if it helps you name me. I would rather be that than a man who turned his face away while Rome burned again and again beneath its own floors." Silence settled thickly after his words. The whispers did not contradict him.
They murmured around the edges. He has seen our ashes. He has walked our forgotten gallows. He has read the pages they wrote as we screamed. He is not wrong about the danger, only about what to do with it. "What will you do with us?" Luca thought finally, voice flat. Father Lorenzo straightened. "You will stand before judgment," he said. "Not here, not in this poor little town. You will be taken to Verona. There is a tribunal there that still remembers the old rites, even if they pretend not to. The Church has ways of handling contamination of this sort." The word contamination slid over Matteo like an oil slick. It coated everything it touched. "They will call it a hearing," the priest continued, "a test. They will examine you, question you, determine whether what moves in you is madness, possession, or something worse. They will want to see what you can do."
Sandro shuddered. "They want a show," his thoughts whispered, sick and small. "They want to poke at us until the fire snaps." Matteo's head throbbed. The whispers from the stones beneath the room altered, their tone sharpening. The word Verona carried distant echoes with it, rope over beams, cobblestones darkened by things that never washed out, boys hanged while bells rang. "We died there once already," the voices breathed. "They will not be satisfied until they do it properly." Father Lorenzo moved to the door. "Sleep if you can," he said, without irony. "Tomorrow we travel." The lock clicked behind him. Night weighed heavily on the annex. The walls seemed too close together, the ceiling too low. The boys huddled near the bench, none of them lying down. Sandro pressed his back into the corner, knees to his chest, eyes fixed on a point only he could see. Matteo held the grimoire like a shield. Luca sat apart from them, near the opposite wall, one hand still faintly marked where the crypt's heat had kissed his skin. The burns were not severe, but they traced faint, oddly shaped lines across his palm, mirroring the symbol on the book's clasp. "Why did you move toward it?" Matteo thought, not accusing, just needing to understand. Luca did not answer immediately. His gaze remained on the floor. When he finally spoke, in thought, his voice was thinner than Matteo had ever heard it. "Because it promised quiet." The simplicity of the admission cut deeper than any complex explanation. Years of hearing other people's thoughts, other people's fears, other people's desires without consent. Years of being raw and exposed in a world that believed itself silent. Of course, the greatest temptation would not be power or dominion. It would be peace. It would be sleep. Matteo felt his anger at the betrayal crack, letting something softer in. It did not erase the fear, it did not excuse the moment at the pit's edge, but it made it comprehensible. "And now," Luca added bleakly, "he will twist that moment into proof for them. They will point and say, 'Look, the boy stepped willingly toward the fire. He has already chosen.'" Sandro's thoughts trembled. "Will you choose it again?" he whispered. Luca's jaw moved. No sound came. His answer slid into their minds with a heaviness that felt like a promise and a prayer glued together. "Not if I can help it." Outside, a cloud passed over the moon. Darkness deepened. Somewhere farther down the hill, a dog barked once, then again. The echoes of its call bounced between stone walls like someone knocking on the inside of a coffin. Matteo closed his eyes and let the whispers wash over him. They were different here, closer to Verona, nearer to the paths the Church had trampled again and again. Older judgments clung to them. He heard the words of old inquisitors testifying about boys who could recite secrets they had no way to know. He heard the pleas of mothers insisting their children were good. He heard the cold replies of men convinced that good or bad did not matter. Risk did. He heard hanging ropes creak. He heard necks break. He heard a voice very much like his own saying the words they forced into his mouth, confessing to things he had never done just to make the questioning stop. The whispers did not stay purely in the past. They slid forward, curling around tomorrow like smoke around an unlit candle. "Trial," they murmured, "again, this time under a blood moon." The phrase jolted him. He had forgotten the news reports that flickered on televisions in bars and living rooms a week ago, talking about an upcoming eclipse of the moon visible over northern Italy. The villagers in San Damiano barely paid attention. They had their own local horror in the sky already. But the cosmos did not care about local schedules. A lunar eclipse, Matteo thought, heart lurching. Red, like blood. Sandro looked up, eyes wide, as if he felt the future pressing down.
Luca exhaled slowly. Of course, he thought. Of course they would call it then. Men like him think in symbols. They will dress it up as liturgy and warning and cleansing. They will not see that the timing feeds the very thing they fear. Matteo opened the grimoire. The pages fluttered until they found a passage near the end he did not remember reading. The script was more frantic here, letters cramped. "Beware those who bind judgment to the sky," the line said. "They think eclipses mark victory over darkness. They do not see that such alignments thin the veil." He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with the part of him that had looked sidelong through time on the vineyard hill. A hall in Verona lit by candles, men in black robes, a moon outside the high windows darkening, then reddening. 3 boys at the center, tied, judged, named. Their fear and the moon's color feeding something that rose from cracks in the city's stones. The pact was not just about boys and pits. It was about spectacle, about stories repeated strongly enough to anchor power where it did not belong. Matteo closed the book. We have to survive the trial, he thought, not just live through it, refuse to be the ending they expect. Sandro let out a weak, humorless huff. How? He whispered. They will ask us questions we cannot afford to answer honestly. They will call any refusal proof. If we show what we can do, we feed their fear. If we don't, they will say we are hiding. We cannot win, Luca added, gaze still fixed on the door. Not on their terms. That, the whispers murmured from the walls, is the first true thing you have said. The door opened at dawn. A different priest stood there this time, younger, with tired eyes and a mouth set in resigned lines. He said they would be taken first to San Damiano to collect some things, to speak with Father Ricci, and then onward to Verona. He did not look at them for long. Whatever he had been told about them had already done its work. They stood for a moment, the 3 of them in the middle of the piazza, at the axis where centuries overlapped. Matteo felt the eyes of the living on his skin and the hands of the dead on his shoulders, pushing, urging, warning. Remember us, they whispered. Do not become our rerun. Then the van doors slammed. San Damiano slid away behind them. The road to Verona ahead was long, not in distance, but in weight. Clouds gathered slowly over the horizon, thin and high. The radio in the front seat crackled with a newsreader's voice, mentioning the upcoming lunar eclipse with casual excitement, calling it the blood moon, describing where and when it would be visible, suggesting that families watched together from balconies and hills. In the back, 3 boys sat without speaking out loud. In their heads, the trial had already begun. The van crossed into Verona just as dusk bled into evening, turning the city's ancient stones a deep, bruised purple. Street lamps flickered awake one by one, their soft halos stretching across narrow alleys and wide piazzas, casting shifting shadows that looked too much like grasping hands. Matteo pressed his forehead to the cool glass and watched the world pass, feeling every whisper rise and fall with the motion of the wheels. Verona didn't sleep even at this hour. It moved with the quiet hum of a city built on centuries of tragedy and beauty. But beneath its rhythm, washed footsteps on marble, voices in cafes, engines rumbling through streets, Matteo sensed something else, something older. The dead here did not murmur, they roared. Their voices surged up from the cobblestones like heat from an overworked forge. They know, Sandro thought, shrinking into his seat as they turned onto a narrow street lined with medieval facades. They know we're coming. He wasn't wrong. The closer they drew to the tribunal building, the louder the whispers became, not the panicked whimpering of small villages, but the structured chorus of a city that had watched countless judgments, countless blood-soaked histories, countless ancient despairs unfold under the same moon they would soon face. The blood moon. Matteo had forgotten how close it was, but now that they were here, he saw it rising between rooftops, huge, swollen, climbing into the sky with an unsettling orange glow that darkened each minute. It was not red yet, but it would be soon. The shadow of the earth already touched one edge, a creeping stain like ink spreading across parchment. The van pulled into a gated courtyard behind a tall stone building. The structure rose 3 stories high, with arched windows barred by iron, and a crest carved above its main entrance, 2 angels holding scales. Below the crest was an inscription in Latin, worn but readable.
In tenebris veritas ardet. In darkness truth burns. Matteo didn't like the choice of words. The doors of the van opened. Cold air rushed in. Matteo stepped out first, followed by Sandro and then Luca. 3 priests waited for them, Father Lorenzo, stern as stone, and 2 others in long black cassocks, faces unreadable. Their presence pressed down on the courtyard like a lid closing on a box. Inside, the building was quiet. Too quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The hallways smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning chemicals, but beneath that, Matteo caught another scent, the metallic tang of fear soaked into the walls. How many confessions, forced or otherwise, had echoed in these corridors? How many pleas had died here? They were taken to a holding room, not a cell. There were no bars, but the door was thick wood, and it locked behind them with a final click. Matteo sat on a bench against the wall. Sandro folded into himself on the floor. Luca stood with his back to the corner, gaze distant, jaw clenched. The blood moon rose outside, casting dim reddish light through the small window near the ceiling. The whispers began almost immediately. Not from the building, from the city. Boys, children, sons, we remember you. Matteo squeezed his eyes shut. Their voices were strong here, too strong. Verona had long been a stage for tragedy, and every tragedy had left something behind. The city's dead were restless, thick in number, and hungry for resolution. But beneath all of them, deeper and older, but infinitely sharper, another whisper cut through the rest. Come. Matteo's breath caught. The pit beneath San Pellegrino reached even here. It called through gravel and soil and aqueduct and bone. The distance meant nothing. The fire whispered like a lover and a captor both. Come. Bond. Break. Rise.
Luca flinched. Sandro curled tighter. The tribunal room was not far. Matteo sensed it through the walls, the architecture of it, the vaulted ceiling, the cold bench where they would sit, the watching eyes of men ready to carve judgments with their questions. Time passed strangely. Minutes blurred. The moon rose higher and darkened more. A knock finally came at the door. It opened. Father Lorenzo entered. But something in him had changed. He looked older, as if the moonlight had aged him.
His eyes held something brittle and strained. Not doubt, never doubt, but a tension pulled taut as a violin string. "It is time," he said. They followed him. He led them down a hallway, then another, until they reached a set of tall double doors carved with the same sigil as the grimoire. The sight made Matteo stumble. The fire had been whispering through Verona long before any tribunal claimed this place. The doors opened. The tribunal chamber unfolded before them. A long table, draped in crimson cloth. Candles flickered in iron holders along the walls. The ceiling arched high overhead, its ribs like bone. A crucifix hung behind the tribunal's 3 chairs, enormous and heavy. 3 priests sat there already, 2 older men, faces severe, and 1 younger, expressionless. Their black robes seemed to absorb all the air in the room. Matteo was placed on the central bench. Luca sat at his right. Sandro sat at his left. They were not bound, but they might as well have been. The blood moon shone through a row of narrow windows high on the wall, bathing the chamber in a thin red glow that made every shadow longer and every face harder. Father Lorenzo addressed the tribunal. He spoke of the crypt, of the pit, of the boys. He did not lie, but his truth was shaped by fear, sharpened by conviction, twisted by years of hunting shadows. Sandro trembled.
Luca sat stiff as stone. Matteo stared ahead, pulse pounding. Then the questioning began. Not with accusations, with calm, measured inquiries. Have you heard voices not of this world? Have you seen things others cannot see? Have you ever felt compelled to do harm? Matteo answered as carefully as he could. Yes, yes, no. Sandro whispered his answers too softly for the room, but the priests leaned in, hungry for every word. Luca hesitated more than once. When they asked whether he had ever communicated thoughts without speaking, he looked at Matteo, then at Sandro, then at the tribunal. Yes. A murmur went through the chamber. Matteo wanted to scream at them all. These weren't sins. These weren't choices. These were accidents of birth, accidents of fire, accidents of a world that twisted around boys it never understood. The priests finally asked the question Matteo dreaded most. Would you submit to exorcism? The air froze. Matteo felt the grimoire hidden under his shirt pulse once like a warning. Luca lowered his gaze. Sandro shook his head silently. Matteo opened his mouth to speak, but the entire building trembled. A deep, resonant boom echoed under the floor.
Dust drifted from the ceiling. The tribunal members stiffened. Another tremor rolled through the stones, stronger this time. The blood moon outside reached its full eclipse, turning a deep, terrible red that seeped into the chamber like a spreading stain. Sandro screamed without sound. The whispers exploded. The pit is opening. Matteo saw it in his mind's eye, the crypt back in San Pellegrino. The crack widening, the fire writhing upward, the chains of ancient seals snapping. Father Lorenzo staggered, catching himself on the table, his face drained of color. Luca shouted in thought, voice sharp and breaking. It's using the moon! It's using us! The floor shook again. Cracks spidered across the marble tiles. Candles toppled. The tribunal members rose, shouting prayers, grabbing rosaries, calling for aids. But the fire wasn't listening to them. It was reaching into Verona, reaching into the chamber, reaching for the 3 boys it had marked centuries earlier. Matteo clutched the grimoire. The whispers roared in his skull. The choice is now. Bind it or let it rise.
Sandro collapsed, convulsing in silent terror. Luca grabbed Matteo's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "We cannot let it choose for us," he thought fiercely. "We must choose ourselves, together, or it'll take whichever of us breaks first." Matteo looked up at the red moon, bleeding its color over the tribunal chamber. The fire surged under Verona.
Screams rose in the hallways. Father Lorenzo stared at the boys, not with judgment now, but with dawning horror, as if he had realized too late that everything he had feared was happening not because of them, but because of the Church's centuries of mistakes. Matteo stood. The floor cracked beneath him. The tribunal shouted. Sandro gasped. The pit whispered louder. The blood moon watched. And Matteo felt the moment before choice, the moment when a story can break or remake the world that holds it. He opened the grimoire. The book flared with light, the fire answered, and the entire cathedral district of Verona shuddered under the weight of something ancient finally rising to claim its due. The moment the grimoire opened, the tribunal chamber stopped being a room and became a fault line between worlds. Light burst from the pages, white at first, then molten gold, then a deep, impossible blue that seemed to have weight. It poured upward like liquid dawn, shattering the blood moon's red glow that bled through the high windows. The candles along the walls guttered violently, their flames bending toward the book as if dragged by invisible gravity. Matteo felt the force shoot through his chest, into his ribs, into the marrow of every bone. Sandro arched backward on the ground, a silent scream ripping through his entire body. Luca staggered but did not fall. He gripped Matteo's arm with a strength that felt nothing like panic. It felt necessary, inevitable. The floor beneath them split fully, not a simple crack anymore, a wound. A jagged, yawning rupture spread across the marble, spilling light and heat and something like breath from the depths below the city. The tribunal members fell back, robes tangling at their feet as they stumbled, their faces twisted in awe and terror. One dropped his cross, another clutched his rosary so tightly the beads snapped. Father Lorenzo didn't run. He stood at the table, eyes locked on the boys, not with righteousness now, but with the wild disbelief of a man who had spent decades hunting shadows, only to discover they had been hunting him back. The room trembled again, harder. Files fell from shelves, window panes rattled, dust rained from the ceiling in soft gray sheets. Then came the voices. Not whispers this time, roars, thousands of dead, the centuries of forgotten, buried, silenced victims of witch burnings, accusations, executions rose with the force of a storm. Their cries surged through the tribunal chamber, each one a memory, a wound, a fragment of time clawing its way to the surface. Some begged, some screamed, some chanted old protective rites in languages no longer spoken. But one voice swallowed all the others, the voice of the fire beneath the cathedral, a voice that did not use words, that did not need them, that pressed directly against the skull and heart. "Join!" Matteo fell to his knees. He saw visions, not hallucinations, not dreams, but memories so old they cracked at the edges. Boys like them standing on the edge of pits, their hands glowing with the same impossible light pouring from the grimoire now. Priests in black robes screaming prayers as the ground burned. Villagers running from flames that never touched wood, only souls. Each scene blurred into another. Then the grimoire flipped its pages on its own. It opened to a blank spread near the end. The light dimmed, the roaring quieted.
A single sentence began to etch itself onto the page, letters carved by some unseen hand, burning into the parchment like brand marks. The three must choose. Matteo's breath shook. He looked at Luca. Luca met his eyes, and Matteo saw everything at once: fear, exhaustion, a lifetime of being hunted by a world that never understood him, and a strange, terrible calm. Sandro crawled toward them, his thin frame trembling. The fire inside him, the painful sensitivity that had always marked him, blazed so brightly Matteo could almost see it under his skin. The three must choose. Choose what? He felt the question echo inside his skull. Not from him alone, from the world, from the dead, from the fire. The grimoire turned one more page. A new message wrote itself with blinding speed. Bind us, or free us. Matteo's heart froze. He understood. The pit, the fire, the ancient force buried under San Pellegrino and clawing up through Verona was not simply evil. It was older than good or evil. It was a hunger, a force, a living wound in the world. And the witch boys, every generation of them, had always stood between the fire and the world above. Jailers born in childhood, sacrificed before adulthood. Each trio had either bound the fire tighter or, through fear and coercion, allowed it to loosen. Luca had been right. They were not cursed, they were chosen. Matteo rose slowly, clutching the grimoire, and stepped toward the rupture in the floor. Heat radiated upward like breath. Shadows reached for him. Something in the pit recognized him, not as prey, not as offering, but as what he truly was. A hinge.
A gate. A voice the pit needed. The fire roared upward in a brilliant column. Sandro screamed again, but this time the sound came out, a terrified, raw cry that echoed off the chamber walls. The tribunal members clung to each other as the light reflected in their panicked eyes. Luca grabbed Sandro's hand. Then he grabbed Matteo's. Matteo felt the connection snap closed like a circuit. 3 boys, 3 signs, 1 choice. Father Lorenzo took one unsteady step toward them. "Stop!" he shouted, voice shaking with something painfully close to pleading. "You don't know what you're doing!" Matteo turned. For the first time, he looked directly at the man who had hunted them, not with hate, but with clarity. "No," Matteo whispered inside the priest's mind. "You don't know." Then the boys stepped to the edge of the fault line. The fire rose. The dead screamed. And the grimoire blazed so brightly it became impossible to look at. Matteo reached toward the pit, not with hands, but with the part of him that had heard the dead since the eclipse. Sandro reached too, his skin blazing, every nerve aflame with the touch of the spirits. Luca's mind opened fully, no longer shielding itself, no longer holding back. He projected his thought downward into the fire, into the wound, into the heart of the ancient force that had sought them.
We choose binding. The fire paused. The city held its breath. The moon froze in its bloody eclipse. Matteo's voice joined Luca's. Sandro's followed. We choose binding. The fire screamed, not in rage, but in recognition, in memory, in ancient acknowledgement. The chamber shook so hard the crucifix on the wall cracked down the middle. The tribunal men fell to the floor. Father Lorenzo shielded his head with his arms. Light flooded upward through the boys' linked hands, pouring into the pit, sealing its edges, stitching the rupture together with threads of something not quite magic and not quite prayer. Matteo felt the dead press against him, not to drag, not to drown, but to lend their strength. The boys from centuries ago stood with them, unseen, unknown, their voices merging into the chant of the present. Bind it, bind it, bind it. The fire resisted. It pushed upward violently. Sandro nearly broke under the pressure. Luca's nose bled. Matteo's vision blurred. But they held. 3 boys whose stories had never been written in history. 3 boys the world wanted to judge before ever understanding. 3 boys who had been condemned long before they were born. They held. The fire subsided, slowly, painfully, with a roar like a dying world. The light dimmed, the crack in the floor tightened, the glow faded into darkness, and then silence. A silence so deep and absolute, Matteo didn't realize at first that he was still standing. The light from the grimoire had faded, the book fell shut in his hands. His knees collapsed, he hit the ground.
Sandro slumped sideways, breathing hard, eyes half rolled back. Luca fell backward but caught himself on one elbow, chest heaving. Father Lorenzo rose slowly, staring at them with something that was neither awe nor hatred. It was understanding. Terrible, late, broken understanding. The tribunal men crawled to their feet. The blood moon outside began to lighten, returning to gray. Matteo pushed himself upright. He looked at Luca, then at Sandro, then at the grimoire, and a single truth settled in his bones. They had bound the fire, but a price had been paid. Something inside each of them had been scorched, marked, changed. Not corrupted, no. Something sacrificed. Something the world would never understand and never acknowledge. Father Lorenzo stepped forward. He opened his mouth. No scripture came out, no accusation, no triumph, only quiet words that trembled at the edges. "What are you?" Matteo lifted his gaze. For the first time since the eclipse, his own voice, hoarse, cracked, rose from his throat. "Protectors." Luca nodded faintly. Sandro's trembling stopped. The dawn outside did not brighten the way it should have, not yet. The sky remained heavy with the remnants of the blood moon, but the danger had passed. Not forever. The pit would sleep, for a time, maybe for centuries.
But the binding would hold, as long as there were boys like them, as long as someone remembered, as long as someone chose. Matteo closed the grimoire. Luca stood beside him. Sandro took his hand, and together, under the fading red moon, they walked out of the tribunal chamber, not as victims, not as accused, but as the newest and perhaps last of the witch boys of Italy. The dawn came late that morning, but it came, and somewhere beneath Verona the fire dreamt in chains woven from the will of 3 boys who had finally rewritten a history meant to destroy them.